He was just a kid, smiling, polite, and proud to pay for his own breakfast. But in that diner, his skin spoke louder than his words. One cruel man decided he didn't belong there, and in a heartbeat the laughter stopped. The slap echoed through the room, louder than the clatter of plates, louder than the whispers of fear. No one knew who that little boy's father was, or what kind of power waited behind those innocent eyes. What happened next would turn that quiet diner into the center of a storm no one saw coming. It was a quiet Sunday morning in Georgia, the kind of morning where sunlight slipped through the blinds and the world felt safe. 8-year-old Caleb Johnson loved mornings like this. He'd wake up early, brush his hair the way his mama liked, and rush to get dressed in his favorite red shirt with the faded superhero logo. Sundays were their breakfast days, a small tradition he shared with his dad whenever business slowed down enough for family time. To anyone watching, they were just another father and son heading to a diner. But behind that simple picture was a story most people would never guess. Caleb's father, Marcus Johnson, wasn't just any man. He was calm, disciplined, and carried himself with quiet authority. Most people in town knew him as the successful owner of several local businesses, a man who had turned his life around from the rough streets of Chicago to build something better for his family. Few knew that years ago, Marcus had ties to a powerful underground network, one that most men feared to even speak about. He had walked away from that life, trading violence for peace, chaos for family. That morning, he just wanted pancakes and laughter with his son. The diner wasn't fancy, just a small place with checkered floors, the scent of coffee and bacon filling the air, and a jukebox that hadn't worked right in years. For Marcus, it wasn't about the food. It was about showing his son the world, teaching him respect, pride, and strength in a world that didn't always offer it in return. Caleb loved how people smiled at him when he held the door open, how the waitress always called him sweetheart, and how his father's deep laugh made the whole diner seem warmer. He didn't notice the way some people stared at them, the brief, uncomfortable looks from a few regulars who thought they didn't belong. He was too young to understand what those glances meant. Marcus, however, noticed every single one. He had seen those eyes his whole life. Eyes that didn't just look at you, but through you. Still, he ignored it. He had promised himself that Caleb would grow up believing the world could be kind. So he smiled at the waitress, placed their order, and tried to focus on the sound of his son's excitement as Caleb talked about school, about wanting to be a pilot, about everything that made him believe his future was bright. But beneath that calm exterior, Marcus carried an unease he couldn't shake. He'd felt it the moment they stepped inside. The tone in a stranger's laugh, the whisper that trailed off too suddenly, signs he'd learned long ago to read like a second language. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. At a corner booth sat a man he hadn't noticed before, a big, broad-shouldered regular with a smirk that came too easily. He was laughing with a group of friends, but his eyes lingered on Caleb longer than they should have. There was something sharp behind that smile, something ugly. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, instinctively placing himself between the man and his son. Outside, the day was bright and ordinary, but inside the diner, the air felt different now, heavier, tense. Caleb didn't sense it. He was too busy reaching for the syrup bottle with both hands, trying to prove he didn't need help. Marcus smiled faintly, helping him anyway. It was supposed to be just another Sunday morning. But sometimes the most ordinary days hide the darkest turns, and before that breakfast was over, one man's hate and another's buried past were about to collide in a way that would leave the whole town talking. Because when cruelty meets power, it doesn't end quietly. It never does. The diner had never felt this quiet. The hum of conversation dulled, replaced by the faint sizzle from the kitchen. Caleb, still oblivious, swung his legs beneath the table, humming a cartoon tune between bites of syrup-soaked pancakes. But Marcus felt the shift, the way laughter at the corner table had turned sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. At first, it was a whisper, a low snicker, then a muttered word that made Marcus's jaw tighten. He didn't turn, didn't speak. He'd learned long ago that silence could be stronger than anger. But the group behind them wasn't looking for peace. They were looking for a reaction. The biggest of the men, the same one who'd been watching earlier, leaned back in his chair, his boots scraping loudly against the floor. He smirked, loud enough for everyone to notice, and said something about certain kinds of people taking up too much space in good diners. His friends laughed, but it wasn't humor. It was cruelty. Caleb didn't understand. He looked up at his dad, puzzled. Marcus only said softly, "Finish your food, son." His voice was calm, but his hand gripped his coffee cup so tightly his knuckles whitened. He'd been here before, in towns where hate dressed itself as a joke, in rooms where his skin made him a target before he even spoke. He wanted to leave, but he also didn't want Caleb to grow up thinking that backing down was the only way to survive. When Caleb stood up to grab a napkin, that's when it happened. A sudden motion. A chair scraping back. The bully, his face red from too many drinks and too much arrogance, blocked Caleb's path. He towered over the boy, fake smiling. "You gonna clean up after yourself, boy?" he sneered. Caleb blinked, confused. "Yes, sir," he said politely, his small hand reaching for the napkin. But before he could take another step, the man's hand came down, hard. The sound of the slap cracked through the diner like thunder. Plates stopped clinking. Forks froze midair. The laughter died instantly. Caleb stumbled back, his cheek burning, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment he didn't cry. He just stood there, frozen, the sting of humiliation sinking in. Marcus didn't move, not at first. He looked at his son, the disbelief, the hurt, the silence. Then he stood, slowly, deliberately. The air in the room changed. "Sir, you need to calm down," someone muttered nervously. But Marcus didn't hear it. His gaze was fixed on the man who was still smirking, proud of what he'd done. "Man's gotta teach respect," the bully muttered. No one spoke. The waitress looked horrified. An elderly couple near the window whispered to each other, but stayed seated, afraid. Everyone could feel the tension building, the quiet before something unstoppable. Marcus stepped forward, placing a steady hand on Caleb's shoulder. His voice was low, controlled. "Go wait by the car, son." Caleb hesitated, trembling. He'd never seen his father's eyes look like that. Cold, still, like a storm waiting to break. When the door closed behind the boy, Marcus finally turned back. The man laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "What, you gonna do something about it?" Marcus didn't answer. He simply stared. Long enough for the laughter to fade, long enough for the man's confidence to waver. There was something in Marcus's expression, something dangerous, quiet, and ancient. The waitress tried to step in, voice shaking. "Please, sir, let's not make this worse." But Marcus only whispered, "It's already worse." He walked out without another word, leaving the diner in stunned silence. The bully laughed again, trying to reclaim control, but his hands were shaking now. Something about the way that man looked at him. It wasn't fear. It was promise. Outside, Caleb sat in the car, wiping his face with the back of his hand. His father said nothing as he started the engine, the quiet hum of the car filling the space between them. But behind that silence, something old was waking up. Something Marcus had buried years ago. That diner thought they had humiliated a father and son. But by nightfall they would learn the truth. They hadn't slapped a helpless boy. They had struck the son of a man no one dared to cross, and the storm that was coming would leave no one untouched. Night fell heavy over the town, quiet, uneasy, waiting. The diner had closed early. No one spoke about what had happened, but everyone knew. By evening, whispers had already spread. The black man whose boy got hit. The one who used to run with dangerous people. Some laughed it off. Others warned the bully to keep his head down. But arrogance doesn't listen to fear. Marcus didn't return home right away. He drove aimlessly, his thoughts burning. The image of Caleb's small face, red from that slap, haunted him like a ghost. The humiliation. The innocence shattered. He had spent years building a life of peace, teaching his son that strength wasn't in revenge but in restraint. Yet that diner, that man, had ripped open every wound he had ever tried to heal. By the time he parked outside his old friend's bar, a place where whispers of his past still lingered, Marcus had already made his decision. He didn't need weapons or threats. He had power, and power spoke louder than fists. The next morning, the diner owner arrived to find black cars lined up outside, sleek, silent, and unmistakably out of place in a small Georgia town. Men in suits stood beside them, their faces expressionless. Inside, the bully sat at his usual spot, nursing a hangover and pretending nothing had happened. But when the bell over the door chimed and Marcus walked in, everyone went still. He wasn't the same man they'd seen the day before. The calm smile was gone. His posture, measured, unshakable, demanded attention. Even the waitress, who had watched everything unfold the day before, felt her breath catch. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He walked to the counter, the echo of his footsteps louder than any words. "Where's your man?" he asked the owner quietly. The bully turned from his seat, still trying to grin. "You again? Thought you'd—" But he never finished the sentence. The men in suits stepped forward, forming a silent wall between him and everyone else. Marcus took one more step, close enough that the bully could see the cold fire in his eyes. "You put your hands on my son," Marcus said. Each word landed like a strike. "And now you'll remember who he belongs to." The diner felt like a cage of glass, ready to shatter. The bully's smirk faltered, replaced by confusion, then fear. He'd heard rumors before, about the man who once ran things in Chicago, about how even cops stepped aside when he spoke. But he hadn't believed them, until now. Marcus leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I could end you. Right here, right now, but I won't." He paused, letting the silence choke the room. "Because my son's watching, and he needs to see what real power looks like." He nodded once, and his men stepped back. Then Marcus turned toward the stunned crowd. "You all watched it happen," he said evenly. "You all saw that man hit a child, and not one of you stood up." His gaze swept across every face, some ashamed, some frozen, some angry at their own cowardice. "Next time you see hate, don't wait for someone like me to walk in. Because next time, no one will stop it before it burns everything down." He turned to leave. The sound of his shoes on the tile echoed like thunder in the silence. Caleb stood by the door, eyes wide, unsure whether to be proud or afraid. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "We're done here." As they stepped outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, spilling light across the empty street. Inside, the bully sat shaking, realizing he hadn't just faced a man. He'd faced a reckoning. And as the door closed behind them, the entire diner understood one thing. That slap hadn't just woken a father's rage. It had awakened a truth the whole town had tried to ignore. Because respect earned through fear fades, but the memory of injustice never does. The sun was high when Marcus and Caleb reached home. The silence in the car had been heavy, like both were afraid to break it. Caleb's cheek still bore the faint red mark, but what hurt more was the confusion in his eyes. He didn't understand why someone would hate him for something he couldn't change. Marcus parked the car and sat quietly for a moment before speaking. "Son," he said softly, The world's not always fair. But you can't let it turn you cold. His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of what he'd almost become again. For years, Marcus had worked to bury his past. He had built a new life, one where respect came from kindness, not fear. But that morning, standing in that diner, he had felt the pull of his old self, the one that fought injustice with power, not peace. He'd seen how quickly rage could rise, and how easy it would have been to destroy that man, to make him pay. But what would Caleb have learned then? That violence was the answer to hate? That dignity could only be reclaimed through dominance? Marcus knew better. He knew that true strength wasn't in what you could do, but in what you chose not to. In the following days, word of what happened spread far beyond that small town. Some called Marcus a hero, others called him a threat, but no one could deny the truth of what they'd witnessed. A man who refused to be humiliated, and a community forced to confront its silence. The diner's owner publicly apologized. The bully disappeared, quit his job, sold his house, and left town. But the damage wasn't only his to carry. The shame belonged to everyone who had watched and said nothing. For Caleb, life would never look the same again. Schoolmates whispered about the diner incident, some out of curiosity, others out of guilt. But instead of bitterness, he carried something else: understanding. He had seen his father stand tall not just as a man, but as a lesson, that being black in America often meant fighting battles you didn't start, and teaching lessons you shouldn't have to. Months later, Marcus took Caleb back to that same diner, not to eat, but to remind him. They stood outside quietly, the sign still flickering above the door. "You see," Marcus said, "some people will always see color before character. But that's their blindness, not yours. Don't ever let their hate define who you are." Caleb nodded, his eyes stronger now. That scar of memory would stay, but it would shape him, not break him. And as they walked away, Marcus realized something profound. That day in the diner wasn't just about racism, it was about silence. The silence of the onlookers, the silence of those who claim to see nothing, the silence that lets cruelty breathe. Because racism doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, hides, and waits for people to look away. The story of that diner could have ended in blood and vengeance. Instead, it ended in reflection, a reminder that real power isn't in revenge, but in showing the world what humanity should look like when the world refuses to. But the question remains, how many more fathers have to teach their sons the same lesson? How many more children must learn that innocence alone doesn't keep them safe? This isn't just one family's story. It's a mirror held up to a nation still learning what equality truly means. And if watching this made your heart ache or your hands tighten in anger, then remember this. Change doesn't start with power. It starts with courage. The courage to speak up when silence feels safer. The courage to stand up when standing alone. The courage to see a child, not a color. Because until we all learn that lesson, the next diner, the next street, the next innocent face could be another story just like this one. And the real question is, will we still be watching, or will we finally act?